Welcome back. The title of this mini lecture is The Atlantic World, Part 1. So let's get into it. So, the first term that, if we're going to be talking about the Atlantic world, that we should probably define is the Atlantic world. What do we mean by this? So, generally, what scholars are referring to when they're referring to the Atlantic world is they're referring to kind of the process of environment and interaction that's happening really beginning after 1492 between Europe, between the Americas, between the continent of Africa, and every form of connective interaction that's happening there, where that form of connection, that form of environment, was not something that peoples had been experiencing beforehand. Now, that brings us into our second term, which is Columbian Exchange. So, the Columbian Exchange is a term that comes to us from a scholar and historian by the name of Alfred Crosby, who'd been writing about the many forms of interactions that had happened between Europe and the Americas. Much of this was connected to things like foods being connected, the role of disease and culture, and this kind of thing. And it can relate then to things like different kinds of foods originally from the Americas making their way to Europe, but it can also relate to things like diseases such as smallpox or syphilis and the effects, of course, that the violent effects that they would have on peoples. The third term for us is mercantilism. All right, mercantilism. So mercantilism, or to paraphrase, sort of capitalism controlled by the state, is a process of thinking about trade and economic development that happens in European countries, a number of European countries and kingdoms, by the time you get to the beginning of the 17th century. So this is most typified by the Dutch, by the English, and others, and is going to be an active part of understanding how they're facilitating trade and development in this, in the Atlantic world. This also relates then to our fourth term, which is the institution of slavery and the role of the Middle Passage. So, slavery itself was not new to the existence in the Atlantic world, but the institution that develops within the Atlantic world is going to be a central part of the Atlantic world. It's going to be a central part of the process of the Atlantic world. The first enslaved persons from the continent of Africa arrive in the Americas beginning around 1502. The first enslaved persons from the continent of Africa that arrive in British North America do so in 1619. So you're looking at eventually well over 10 million individuals from the continent of Africa that are forcibly enslaved and removed and sent to the Americas over the course of the next few hundred years. The brutal process by which enslaved persons were forced to endure that passage is often referred to as the Middle Passage. And this is an incredibly violent and dehumanizing process that enslaved persons were forced to endure as a part of this institution of enslavement. So, understanding that while the Atlantic world may involve these other aspects, we must understand that it is fundamentally, much of it is built on, right, this horrific process of the institution of slavery and the mistreatment of individuals from the continent of Africa. Now, this brings us to our last term, which is kind of colonial. The best way to phrase it would sort of just be, varying colonial governments. So by the time you get in to the middle part of the 1600s, you're going to really have these vastly distinct and different colonial governments and cultures that are being established, and a focal point on economy and society and culture within each. So you're going to have New France, you're going to have British North America, you're going to have colonial Brazil, which more enslaved persons from the continent of Africa will eventually be trafficked to Brazil than any other place. You're going to have, colonial New Spain, which is going to be a part of this process as well. So, in order to really understand the Atlantic world, we have to understand, of course, as well, the diversity of these colonial experiences, too, in order to get a sense of these varied perspectives. Thank you very much.